So my presentation is going to start with providing a very broad overview of the human past in the province, and I'll bring it right up until the present time. When I wrote this book, it was I primarily to demystify archaeology. You know, very few people in the province really understand what archaeology is. It seems to be either over-sensationalized by the media when something really interesting comes out, or it's viewed as a hindrance to development when somebody finds something, you know, in a development site. And there's a large misunderstanding about like how archaeology is regulated, how we make our interpretations, and that sort of thing. So this book is designed for the general public who just wants to understand more about the human past and how archaeologists figure it out, and how archaeology is regulated in the province, how we look for sites, how we determine how old they are, how we figure out how people were eating or what they were eating, that sort of thing, right? I can't cover all of that tonight. I couldn't cover all that in this book. You know, I've been doing archaeology in the province for my entire adult life. My first field work in archaeology was 1978, and I never looked back. So I've worked all over the province. I worked in various kinds of archaeology. For the last number of decades, I've been in what we call academic archaeology, based out of a university. Before that, I was working full-time for Indigenous populations and Indigenous nations in the province. And before that, I had my own archaeology company working in advancement of development projects. So I've got, you know, a very broad overview of all of archaeology and how it works. I thought it was a good time to, like, you know, as I was nearing the end of my career, to put all this together. It should have been the easiest book I've ever written. I've written, you know, about 8 books now, but I always thought this would be the easiest book to write, but it turned out to be the most difficult. And I think because I know too much. And, you know, you get everything you know for, you know, almost 50 years of working in the field, and you try to narrow it down into a book, and it's rather difficult. So I just sort of chose some highlights of the human past and archaeological research. I tried not to, like, sensationalize it. I try not to make it too boring. You know, you could have 500 archaeologists in the province, each writing a book, and they would all be substantially different. So this is just my take on the human past and, you know, how archaeology works. There's nothing radical about what I will say. So it's a fairly normative approach to our understanding of the human past. So this book was published in September. I started it 2018, but you know, it was never the top of my priority until 2020, and then COVID hit, and that was a big delay. So I was finally able to get it out, and it hit the market just a few months ago. I'm pretty pleased with it. It's meant for the general public. It's people who are interested in the past, want to know more about the context, about archaeology, about the relationship between First Nations and archaeologists, etc. The cover is a photo of Escangwai, which is more popularly known as an instance on Haida Gwaii. As far as I know, it's the only World Heritage Site in the province. But the World Heritage List has over 1,000 sites listed from UNESCO. I think this is the only cultural site in the province. But you have to appreciate that whole World Heritage List is very biased in itself. It's not in the interests of provincial governments or federal governments in many cases to promote archaeological sites as being worthy of heritage status. But this one snuck under the wire in the 1970s. It's a very popular site if you go to Haida Gwaii. So in the 1950s, a number of professionals, anthropologists, cut down some of the totem poles, and some of them are now spread around Vancouver, including the Museum of Anthropology. clearly an ancestral Haida site. It's never been fully excavated. There's only been test excavations there, but it's pretty clear that it's at least several thousand years old. Most of the oldest sites that we have, or documented oldest sites in the province, come from the northern and central coast of the province, and those now extend into the 15,000 year range. And for archaeologists, British Columbia is extremely interesting to, or archaeologists all over North America or in South America, because it's through British Columbia that the ancestors of all Indigenous peoples came. Starting around 15,000 years ago. When people started coming to the Americas, most of Canada was covered in ice. The coastal region of British Columbia wasn't. People came via Asia. They came down the coastal routes. Many different waves of people. So it's pretty much consensus on that. This is the way they came, was through the coastal route. Lots of important sites on the coastal route. I can't go through them all now, but one of the most interesting sites that was discovered just a few years ago is in the Central Coast. It's an island site, Calvert Island, where they found footprints that date to 13,000 years ago. And some of the footprints are rare to preserve. It's really difficult to preserve footprints. So here we have a series of footprints, and one of the interesting things about these footprints is they're all on. They're not linear. There's not like usually when you find footprints that preserve, there's people walking in a straight line. These ones are all jumbled up. And the common interpretation of that is they were getting out of a boat. Their feet were sinking into the sand and the mud out of a boat 13,000 years ago. And that makes sense to a lot of archaeologists because although we don't have boats, most archaeologists are comfortable with the notion that people coming down the coast of BC, that up at least 15,000 years ago or more, probably had boats. And they probably and some of them continued on. So we see settlement, for example, off some of the islands of California in the 14,000 year range where they would have needed boats to get there. So moving to the interior part of the province, this is a cave site near Fort St. John. This is a very interesting site. It's in the interior region of the province. It's one of the oldest sites. This site dates to about 12,500 years old, and it was relatively continuously occupied. Not permanently occupied, but over that span of 12,500 years, we see many different periods of occupation there and many different uses. Most of the finds have been discovered actually in the part outside of the cave, not inside the cave itself. So people were like sitting outside or throwing their stuff out of the cave. It was excavated in the 1980s, again in the 1990s, and it's currently being excavated again by archaeologists working out of the University of Northern British Columbia. It's interesting for many reasons beyond just having this relatively continuous period of occupation. It's one of the oldest sites in the province, and even more than 10,000 years ago in that close to 12,000 year range, we see artifacts, spear points that tie them with other Indigenous peoples throughout what is now Eastern Canada and the United States. They have particular styles of artifacts, spear points, used for hunting big game animals like mammoths and mastodons and giant bison that no longer exist. And we see those same kind of tools already up near Fort St. John. So there was that was links with other people around the world. There's a special, unique way of making those artifacts. So we see them there. Also, close to 12,000 years ago, we see humanly crafted stone beads, like a form of jewelry, right? And this is probably, if not the earliest, amongst the earliest forms of personal adornment that we find in the Americas, which tells us that there was like leisure time involved, right? If you're sitting around, like making jewelry, that's pretty interesting. Sometimes this was used, the site we think was used as a hunting camp, at other times like a lookout, at other times like a residential area, and sometimes for spiritual or sacred events. Within this site, within the deposits, archaeologists found a number of animal bones, which were clearly used for food, but they also interestingly found 2 fully articulated ravens. And they were fully articulated, deliberate burial, right? And they were buried about 1,000 years apart. And this is super interesting, at least to me, because as those of you who are probably familiar with British Columbia, which most of you are, will understand that ravens are really important to Indigenous people. And so here, several thousand years ago, they were also really important that they were afforded special burials, right? So they were intact, fully intact ravens. I mean, the feathers and stuff had gone, but everything, all the bones were still to be able to articulate. So it's a very important site that's still actively being investigated. This property now is owned by a group of First Nations in the area who have taken control of it. They give tours and things like that up there. Archaeology, deals with tangible things. Unlike, history, we don't get a chance to look at the written record very much. So what we typically deal with is the material things, the things primarily, mostly inorganic things. So a lot of the things that we find are made of stone. Certainly we find a lot of other organic materials as well. But the bread and butter of archaeology, is stone tools. And we can tell a lot from stone tools. I mean, I don't know how many we have in the province. I don't know if anybody knows, but probably, would certainly be in the millions and millions of stone tools that we have, and it's easy to identify here. The ones in the person holding in the hand, those would have all been arrowheads. The one in the left would have been like a spear point. They're not all made the same. From looking at individual artifacts, whether we classify it as a spear point or an arrowhead, we can tell typically the approximate age of it and links with other groups. Because there's various ways of making stone tools, and they change through time, and they change based on ethnicity. So that not everybody has the same function. So all those tools or all those points, they could have easily killed an animal, but people have different styles. And it's not random. Right? So we use that kind of information to look at what we call interaction spheres, like who was getting along with who, right? Like how much, if you got the same style of projectile point, a point in, that comes from Vancouver, or you find it in Vancouver, and you also find that same style, and you find it in Lillooet, it means that those people were interacting with each other. So we find lots of stone tools. We have, unlike most areas of the world, British Columbia is one of the very few areas in the world where we don't have pottery. Other areas in the world, mostly it's pottery in terms of like the everyday activity, or you have millions and millions and millions of broken pieces of pottery. We don't have pottery, and it's very unusual not to have pottery in a province. But the reason we don't have pottery here is because the Indigenous people for a very long time were so efficient at making watertight baskets. So, pottery is a great thing, and that's why we start seeing it become widespread around the world, like around 10,000 years ago. We start seeing the first evidence of pottery being made in the world, closer to 18,000 years ago, but it doesn't become widespread until about 10,000 years ago in Asia, Africa, and Europe, and about 5,000 years ago in Central and South, or in the area south of Canada, or south of British Columbia, rather. The people here were so efficient, with making the woven baskets or the birch bark baskets that they didn't need pottery. Because pottery is good. Like anybody can make pottery. You can't control the resource. You pretty much just need clay and water and heat it up. And it's great for storing things, right? It doesn't really cost anything, and even kids can make it. If you break it, like so what? Make another one. But what happened with the Indigenous populations here is that they became so adept at making baskets that could hold water and other materials that there was no need for pottery, right? And because one of the bad things about pottery is it's heavy and it's bulky, and if you're moving around, you don't want to be carrying all that stuff. And another bad thing about pottery is if you drop it, it breaks. But if you have a basket and it's empty, you just fold it up. Take it with you. If you drop it, you just pick it up again, right? So it's interesting. It's really quite interesting to me that we're one of the few areas of the world without pottery. This is one of the most interesting finds to me. I don't often get people sharing my enthusiasm, but what you're looking at there is a small portion of 350,000 small stone beads that were associated with the burial of a single person 4,000 years ago in Sechelt. I can't remember the exact time, but say roughly 10 years ago, the Sechelt Nation contracted with archaeologists from University of Saskatchewan and University of Toronto to excavate a burial site. I don't know why, because usually people don't want to excavate burial sites. Maybe, I'm guessing maybe it was going to be eroded or something. And so the Sea Shelf Nation was aware that this was an important burial site here, so they asked the archaeologists to excavate it. And what the archaeologists found was that indeed it was a very elaborate and sophisticated burial for the elites of the time, 4,000 years ago. The one individual, probably a chief at that time, had probably a cloak buried over top of him, and this cloak had 350,000 beads on it, right? So all the organic material had since decomposed. So they're not totally unusual. We find these beads in burial sites throughout the southern interior and coastal parts of the province that go back thousands of years, but not to this scale. I know it's not unusual to find 10,000 beads with an individual. And always we assume that they were a cloak because they're buried on top of the person. And everything else just decomposed. But this would have been a cloak that you really couldn't have worn on a regular basis. It would clearly be a burial. I think they estimated it's going to be like it would have been about 70 pounds on top. And I think it was probably, 30 or 40 centimeters thick, right? But so this individual had this buried with him. And other individuals also had similar stone beads and sometimes shell beads, and they were sprinkled with ochre, which is a red mineral pigment, which is commonly found in burial sites around the world. So what this goes to is showing you that even 4,000 years ago, there was pretty sophisticated social and political systems around here, right? That's a lot of work. I mean, some archaeologists have done experiments trying to figure out how long it would take to make this cloak. 350,000. I'm not misspeaking. That's 350,000 stone beads that each would have been, drilled by hand. Any hard stone can drill into a soft stone, but it takes a long time. So you're looking at tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of hours of labor 4,000 years ago just for a single garment for a person. This is one of the most interesting discoveries in the province. I like to show this or talk about this one because it shows a great deal of collaboration between archaeologists and Indigenous people. In 1999, 3 hunters from the Kootenays, Nelson, BC, were in the very northwest part of the province, right where the province intersects with the Yukon and Alaska. They were big game hunting for bighorn sheep. And they're very high altitudes, tops of the mountains where, glaciers and frozen snow. As they were searching for these bighorn sheep, they noticed the remains of an individual melting out of the ice. So they did the proper thing. They went and reported it to the authorities. I'm guessing that might have been in Atlin or maybe Whitehorse. I should know that, but I just don't. So they did the proper thing. They said, hey, look what we found here. It's probably really old. Right? And it's in the middle of, very high altitude location where only hunters go. There's no settlements up there. And so within a couple of days, the archaeology branch in Victoria, it's a part of the government, the archaeology branch, they convened a meeting with the local Indigenous groups from that part of British Columbia, as well as nearby the Yukon and Alaska. And they brought in a number of archaeologists, and they let the archaeologists say to the Indigenous populations, if you let us look at the remains, this is what we can do. But if you don't want us to look at the remains, we'll just back off. And that's pretty much the standard of how it works in British Columbia and most of Canada now. It's not always that way in the U.S., but in Canada now, no archaeologist is going to deliberately go look for human remains or dig them up, if they find them without consulting with the First Nation. So the First Nations and the archaeologists struck a deal, and they said, okay, go at it. But there was conditions, and I'm not privy. I wasn't at that meeting, but I know one of the conditions was no photos of the individuals. Take all the photos you want of the artifacts, but no photos of the human remains. And you got them for 2 years, then give them back. And so after 2 years, they gave them back. The local Indigenous communities cremated, then scattered the remains where they were found. As part of the analysis, one of the things they found lots of artifacts, including this cedar woven hat. In perfect condition because it's been frozen, right? And all the artifacts that this individual had shows that they were going back and forth between the interior and coastal regions, which made perfect sense to the local indigenous populations, because people did that all the time. They're travelers. They're probably trading things, but on their own, people were just going back from the coast to the interior. So this is a very coastal artifact. This is very typical of coast indigenous populations. On the other hand, he was wearing a cloak of gopher skins, which was very typical of the interior. And also they could, archaeologists now, we can look at your bones and tell what you were eating, as well as the stuff he was carrying. And we can see that part of his diet, he'd be spending long periods on the coast. You could see a lot of the seafood in his diet, a lot of salmon in his diet. Then we'd see long periods where he was on the interior. So we could see that he was regularly going back and forth. As part of the analysis, they asked the local indigenous populations if they could do some DNA studies and to try to narrow down, who does this person belong to? And a number of the indigenous populations from Alaska and Yukon and British Columbia contributed samples, DNA samples. And what they found, through the analysis, the archaeologists found that he was related to a community in northern British Columbia, and they could get it right down to the clan of people in contemporary times. A number of the contemporary people also gave samples. And I remember talking about this just when that was happening in my class when I was teaching at Capilano University. I remember telling, because it's always been a really interesting story about, how they worked together collaboratively and the kinds of things that they could find out. And I remember it turned out that one of my students knew those three hunters because she was from Nelson too, and she was all excited and getting all excited. Look at me! I know those guys, and she was building on their their credibility, and she was very excited to tell everybody that she knew them, and how they were now semi-famous in Nelson, etc. And then after class that day, I had an Indigenous woman who was in my classroom that day when I was doing it. She came to say, "Can I talk to you for a minute?" And she came in and she told me she's related to that guy. She said she didn't want to talk about that to class because it was a very personal thing. And she said, I don't want anybody else to know, but you should know. And she said a number of her relatives were sampled in the contemporary times, and she was clearly related to this guy who was found there. So at the same time this was going on in British Columbia, there was a similar case going on in Washington State, and it went to the court system for more than 20 years. Because it's very acrimonious. In Canada, First Nations and archaeologists tend to get along really well. In the United States, it's not that case, right? So I don't want to give a blanket statement like that, but it's the norm that, archaeologists will take priority, right? They'll say science, trumps indigenous wishes. So it went 20 years in the court system before anybody was able to actually look at the remains here. Where in Canada here, it took a couple of days, and everyone said, okay, we're good. So that was interesting. Some of the things that archaeologists in BC study, which is not known widely, is we study historic period remains. This is what I started doing myself 20 years ago, including shipwrecks and airplane crashes, as well as fur trade forts and gold mining, etc. This is a site, and they get recorded. In British Columbia, in order to get automatic legislative protection of an archaeological site, it has to predate 1846, unless it's a shipwreck or an airplane crash. Those are immediate. So this one here is just a picture of a Canadian Air Force bomber that went down loaded with several hundred pounds of bombs and 12 passengers in 1945 on Vancouver Island. Amazingly, nobody died. It crashed, but nobody died. And the Air Force knew exactly where it was, so they went in and got the bombs. But now it's a hiking destination. There's another site which I expand on more in the book. I have a highlight of it, that it's in Mount Slesey out near Chilliwack in the Fraser Valley. The one at the time, maybe still, is one of the most tragic air crashes in Canadian history. In the 1950s, a DC-3, I think, went down. It was carrying 62 passengers and 3 crew. They all died, and they couldn't find the plane for a very long time. At that time, there was the largest air search and rescue and ground search and rescue in Canadian history. They couldn't find it. It went down in a storm, near Chilliwack, and eventually some hikers found it, but very, very treacherous and difficult terrain. And about 20 years ago, the provincial government said we should do something about this because they were worried about people going up and looting the site. One of the passengers was rumored to be carrying $60,000 in cash on him. So that would be, motive enough for some people to start going. And we know that a number of people were going up there and messing around with the human remains. Mind you, it's very treacherous to get up there. It's very difficult to get up there. But, people do that anyways. So the provincial government hired an archaeology company to go really investigate it and document it. And they did a really good job. They spent a long time at it, by helicopter and on the ground. And what they found was evidence of a lot of people mucking about. But they saw that the wreckage spread for kilometers, both vertically and horizontally. And one of the reasons they did that was not just to document it, was to bring closure to the families, because a lot of the families wanted closure, and all those families have stayed linked together, for decades and decades. So shipwrecks and air crashes are protected by archaeological legislation. So don't mess around them if you come across one. This is a slide from one of my own archaeological excavations. For 20 years, from the year 2000 to 2019, every summer, almost every summer, I would take a group of Capilano University students up into the Seymour Valley in North Vancouver, and we'd look for and we'd excavate sites. And this is one that reached many people around the world's imagination. The people became interested in it like crazy, and it's a site that I was able to determine was left by a community of Japanese Canadians. It clearly started as a Japanese logging camp. Probably about 1918 or 1919, a Japanese entrepreneur went in there who had a little bit of experience on the Sunshine Coast in logging, and he started logging there. I discovered this site. Well, I found the site when the Metro Vancouver was going to put a new trail from the parking lot to the dam, the Seymour Falls Dam. And the people who were working on it said, hey, we think we have a logging camp here. Are you interested, Bob? And I was working at other sites at the time and said, yeah, I'm interested. I'll go have a look-see. And I thought, okay, this is really easy access for my students and I, so we'll just go here and we'll excavate a logging camp. And I didn't know it at the time. There was very little on the surface that I could see, but there was enough I could tell it was a logging camp from the early 1900s. There was a few pieces of saw blades, a few broken tin cans. It was obvious to me that there was a part of an axe, but it was heavily overgrown with dense underbrush. So I decided, okay, well, the next year we'll go there and we'll excavate. And because nobody, archaeology of logging camps is something that nobody around here has ever done. So I thought I'll start doing that. And lo and behold, I started finding Japanese stuff. And not looking for it, and all of a sudden I had to learn how to, learn a lot about Japanese Canadian history really quickly, while I'm excavating. And I couldn't figure it out easily, but eventually what I was able to figure out was that this site started and was operational seasonally for a few years, probably between about 1918 or 19, and then probably till about 1922 or 1923. Then I think what happened was the Japanese entrepreneur who I know had camps in there, but there's no document to say where he had them. Then he decided to move operations over to Vancouver Island. And because the Seymour Valley was pretty much logged out at that time. And so I think probably what he said to all his workers is he said, I'm going over to Vancouver Island now. And he set up very large operations with railroad logging over in the area around Cumberland. And it became very well known from that time period. So that would have been about 1923 or 1924. And I think he probably said, I'm going over. Anybody want to come with me? And I think at that time, I'm only guessing, I think a lot of the workers said, we're good here. because they had a beautiful camp already set up. They would have built that camp as a logging camp. And it's unlike a typical logging camp because what he had done was what some other Japanese loggers had done as well. Instead of building a big bunkhouse, and, communal kitchen, etc., they built a series of small houses for people. And often the logger would have his wife and sometimes kids there. Right? And so what they would have seen there, they would have like had their own environment there, right? So they could have like had their own houses and stuff, and everything's there. The fresh water system, they had a water system. We found like a very deep water reservoir that had lined with cedar, and they had water pipes throughout the site. And so the water was there. They had fresh creeks all over the place. It would have been clear cut at the time. Beautiful views over the valley. And it would have only taken about 1 hour walk on a trail to the nearest public transit. And nobody would have cared because they'd be up there and, nobody would, you were talking like, 100 years ago, it was just desolate up there. It was just tree stumps. And so, and also in context, at that time, there was a lot of racism against Japanese and Chinese. And at that time, the Japanese consulate was encouraging Japanese people to assimilate. And so if you didn't want to assimilate, here you could go. And so what we found over a course of several seasons there, we found not only evidence of 14 small houses, we found evidence of a Japanese bathhouse, which was, I believe it's the only one excavated outside of Japan, even to this day. And we found evidence of a garden where they would have been growing vegetables. We found evidence of a big water reservoir that was very deep. We found evidence of the privy or the outhouse, which is not really hard to find. And we found evidence of what's probably a small shrine. So it's a pretty interesting site. And so I think that they continued to live there until World War II internment. In 1942, I think it's February 1942, where the Japanese, basically were told to go to Hastings Park, the P&E, where they'll be shipped off to camps. Just carry what you can. I think the Japanese community stayed there from about 1922 or 23 all the way to 1942. And I think when they probably were working at mills or in other jobs in Vancouver and North Vancouver, and they were just told, okay, here's your day to report to Hastings Park. And I think what they did was they just took what they could carry, because that's all really what they were allowed to do, and they just closed the doors behind them and left, thinking they may come back. But they didn't. But because they were thinking they may come back, they hid some of the good stuff. So for example, one of the indicators of where the houses were, because we didn't find any evidence of the actual house, we'd find clusters of household objects. Then we could determine, okay, there was a house here, there was a house here. And one of the common characteristics was that this would be like a heating and cooking stove. You'd find pieces of a heating and cooking stove. And so they were mostly the same. You could find them in the 1917 Woodward's catalog for like $3.50. Except one, excited now, except one that we found on the periphery of the site, uphill, behind a first growth tree stump, clearly not within the area where we were finding other remains. There was another complete disassembled, it had all fallen apart, but all the pieces were there, another cook stove. But it was a very fancy one. And the 1917 Woodward's catalog had that one down for $39. So that was 10 times more expensive. So my guess is that they said, okay, we got to go. We'll go down to Hastings Park with carrying our stuff. They probably will come and loot the site, so we can't hide everything. So, but this stove, that's a pretty fancy stove, and would have been a heavy stove, and they were carrying it uphill. Another thing, and also what was really nice about the site, and what makes it very unique, is that I call it my own little Pompeii, right? Because we get all this really good stuff left behind, right? It's very unusual when you find archaeological sites, they're almost always deliberately abandoned, right? So you take the good stuff with you, right? So like whenever you move, you're not leaving your flat screen TV where you go. You're not leaving all your good stuff. So it's the same in archaeology. Mostly when we find in a settlement, it's been abandoned deliberately. So we get the trash. Here, it's like, especially in those little houses, we get all these really nice artifacts. We get lanterns, we get lots of bottles, we get evidence of their clothing. The material is all decomposed, but we got all the buttons from all the clothing. we get all the medicines, we get toothpaste, we get toothbrushes. One time I found, I'll say I, one of my students found a tube of toothpaste and a toothbrush like this far apart. It's just like they just put it down and left. And so like that's really unusual in archaeology. So it was just to get this quality of artifacts that you don't normally find. Like most of the dishes, most of the rice bowls, and other dishes were just perfectly usable, which is very unusual to find in archaeology. We also found the bathhouse, and we found the foundation of the bathhouse, and you could tell, I could find the ring of nails around the bathhouse would be like a hot tub where they had a fire underneath. Then they'd build the hot tub would have a metal base, wooden sides, and then that whole thing would be in an enclosure. You'd feed the fire from outside underneath. You'd feed the fire, and then you'd have a whole building. So you get in there and you undress and you rinse off, then you get in the tub. And according to the Japanese who come and visit the site all the time, they yell at the kids, more wood in the fire, more wood in the fire, more wood in the fire. But anyways, when we excavated the whole thing, we found the ring of nails around the whole structure so we could see the actual outline of where the walls were. And then within the walls, we found part of a camera. And so it's just like probably another thing that they probably weren't allowed to take when they were going to internment camps. So they probably decided we'll hide it in the bathhouse. Never found any pictures, but found the camera. So that was pretty interesting in itself. It's a really interesting site for those reasons. And I have no smoking gun. All my evidence is circumstantial, but it's I would be surprised if, it's not as I say it is. Over the course of many years, I had my students do waste audits at Capilano University. It was a great initiative of students, faculty, and staff at Capilano University, starting, approximately, probably about 15 years ago now. They decided to annual waste audits, to do a 24-hour audit of every piece of trash and anything that went into the recycle bins for 24 hours. And so that's perfect for archaeologists because what we look at is trash. Normally we're looking at old trash, but now we're looking at trash that was deposited yesterday. So usually on a Monday, on Tuesday morning we'd get there, and normally all the trash would be picked up and all the recycled would be picked up every day. But instead of taking it, to the landfills or, the recycle depots, they would just take it to a certain area in the parking lot on campus and dump it all out there. And then my students and other students from other departments would go through it. And it was fascinating. The goal is one of the most important things that they did at Capilano. The goal is zero waste, and they almost got there because they had such a committed group of students and faculty and staff that would support them. Remember the first time we did an audit, I'm not kidding, that this whole room would have been filled with the black trash bags full. This whole room. The first time, it was overwhelming. There's no way we were going to get through it all. There was just so much trash. By the last year I was involved in it, 6 or 7 years ago, the amount of trash, from 24 hours, was just this little corner here. Our big worry was we can't have too many students because we can't get through it all. And that's because of the commitment of all the people. One of the first things that they found that first year was the number one item in the trash at Capilano University was trash bags. So that guy said, so they just went around. That was education. Education works a lot when it comes to trash. So they just made the announcements to everybody and said, hey, or they put it in better language. But essentially it was like the number one item on campus in the trash is trash bags. So what they decided to do on a voluntary basis, if you're willing to give up your trash can in your office, in the hallway, in, wherever you are, because there was trash cans everywhere. Like every office had a trash can. Every classroom had multiple trash cans. In the hallways, trash cans. And really quickly, everyone said yeah, wow. And everybody did, voluntarily gave up their trash cans. And so just thinking in the social science area where I was, we went from 50 trash cans to 1, overnight. And it was amazing how much that reduced the trash. And every year, this committed group of individuals, which was rotating, was really good. So it worked, right? So my students were never very happy with the idea that, it was a requirement. It wasn't an optional activity. And almost all of them liked it. There was a few that found it all disgusting, but most of them appreciate it. I gave them a good idea about how archaeology really works. We're just dealing with yesterday's trash, literally, rather than, thousands of years ago. Here's another project that I'm interested in. I'm working a little bit off and on now. This site is in West Vancouver. It's the site of what is probably the world's oldest buried skateboard park in the world. You're laughing at my research. It's a challenge. I didn't start this project, but I came on as a co-director. It was started by a fellow by the name of Bruce Emmett, who did his master's degree in art at Emily Carr University. And he looked at this buried skateboard park as sculpture. It was art. And for a number of years, he had tried to get permission to excavate it and had established, he created a whole community of people in the skateboard industry and artists who wanted to excavate this, but they were getting nowhere. So one day he heard me on the radio and that I was interested in recent stuff. And so he contacted me and he said, I got this project. Are you interested? And I said, yeah, for sure. If not, because a skateboard park, because I don't know anything about skateboard parks. And, when skateboarding was in vogue when I was a kid, it was still like, metal rollerblades or roller skates that you put on a piece of plywood. So I can't roller skate. And I thought the opportunity to deal with artists would be really interesting because I'm not very creative. And I thought, wow, that'd be really interesting. And the kicker was knowing it was in West Vancouver where there'd be enormous resistance to it. Right? If there's any place in the world that is most resistant to skateboarding, it's West Vancouver. And so I and my partner Bruce now, we've been at this for more than 10 years. And the story has become one of the resistance. So I've already published articles on it. I've given two presentations at scholarly conferences in Europe because Europe is much more attuned to this. Like in North America, it's very conservative in archaeology, but in Europe, they're all over it. And I remember one of the proposals I put in for them. I kept putting in more proposals, everything from let me go into the site on a rainy November afternoon on a Saturday when no one's around and let me just do a test pit to assess the integrity of it, all the way up to let's make this a multi-year project with all the students and teachers and anybody in West Vancouver involved. And there was everything in between. They kept saying no, no, no. And there was one that came back at me, one of the rejections from the West Vancouver School Board, who owns the property. They literally said, I was so surprised to put this in writing, that say, we see no value in skateboarding or archaeology. And so they 2 weeks later, I was at a conference in England talking about this project, and this whole scholarly session was called Archaeology and Skateboarding. And other people presenting in that conference were professors from Cambridge and Oxford universities in England. But it wasn't good enough for West Vancouver. Anyways, the challenge goes on. So what you see here is somebody, my partner Bruce, holding up a picture of somebody skateboarding exactly there. And that right now it's grass, and it's in an out-of-the-way part of the school grounds, and they just don't want anything to do with it. So someday, maybe, we'll see. This is another slide. Again, I mentioned earlier, my most recent project, which I still think of reinvigorating, was archaeology of COVID in Metro Vancouver. When COVID hit, it seems like 5 years ago, right? Or 6 years ago, wasn't that long ago. I just shut down my field projects and I had to start teaching remotely online. And I didn't like any of that stuff because I was used to doing field work every summer and dealing with smart students who could act as research assistants and stuff. And then one day, I think in 2020, there was an email came out to all faculty from the university and said, something along the lines, in better English than I'm going to say, but the government's given us some money if you're interested in doing research on COVID. And so I imagine they were thinking they were going to get proposals from people in the sciences and biology or economics or something. But I said, I'm going to apply for that. And so I applied immediately, and I got money. I just wanted to give like an archaeology of COVID in Metro Vancouver. And I was with enough money to hire research assistants. And they said, okay. So I went to work, and it spread. Our work lasted several months over late 2020 to throughout the first half of 2021. And what I did was document as best we could samples of art and graffiti. So what you see there is the murals on the left over there. So I wanted to document COVID-related art and graffiti. So on the left here, you see all the health workers were depicted in very positive manufacturers. So here, the superheroes, doctors and nurses as superheroes. That was all over the place. And then, and graffiti. And it was interesting with the graffiti, you could see, initially all the graffiti you could see throughout Metro Vancouver was positive, but then it started changing. It's a conspiracy, it's the government, it's just like, and then you'd see like arguments within the graffiti. People fighting each other through the graffiti, and you could see all that. And if you saw, and over the course of time, you could see that the murals and the art got increasingly negative as well. So where it all started, was highly positive, support the health workers. You started seeing it go into more, it's all a conspiracy, that sort of thing. And the positive artwork tended to stay around for a long time. The negative stuff got washed immediately. So what we did was I'd find something in the news or it's here on the radio, and so either myself or one of my researchers said, you got to get down there and document it. You got to get down and document it, because if it's negative especially, it's not going to stay, right? People are going to take it away immediately. And the one on the right is just a mask. Masks are ubiquitous. They're everywhere. I don't think people had any idea how many masks there were. Like, just in Metro Vancouver, there were just so many. It didn't take very long. There was too many for us to gather, so we just documented them, precise locations. And also we looked at what I called structures, like the signs. Remember the signs that told you to stay away 6 feet, and have these pictures of like an eagle or a cougar or 6 dogs or something, like we didn't know how much 6 feet was. Anyway, so I documented all those, as well as some kind of the structures, barriers, when they started moving, barriers to allow people to eat outside on the sidewalks and that sort of thing. So what we saw was no one paid any attention to any sign whatsoever. It was kind of a waste of time, all those signs. No one went close to a sign at all. Again, as I mentioned, the art was, if it was positive, it stayed. If it was negative, it left. The masks, people stopped seeing them. I think it was like, in the 70s or 80s, it was like cigarette butts, right? People became oblivious to them. But I'd have to train my students, like, this is, because they degrade really quickly, right? So this one, I started doing a study, like, this is what it looks like after 5 days. This is what it looks like after 2 weeks, and things like that. And one of the interesting things we did with this was that I compared areas. I looked at a number of areas. One was the downtown east side. We want to see what's going on in the downtown east side. Another was West Vancouver, the area around Dunderave. Another was in North Vancouver, particularly the area around Lonsdale. And then there were parts of the Fraser Valley. And then sometimes I went up to Whistler as well. And I wanted to compare what was going on in those areas to see whether there's a socioeconomic thing. And unsurprisingly, there was. Like, it was wherever we saw the most art came from the downtown east side, positive and negative. That's where you saw the art. But nobody was wearing masks in public when you were supposed to down in the downtown east side. So what you saw of all the masks, they were always just accumulated outside the doorways to public buildings, where they were going in for services or appointments or something. So it'd be like when you came out of that building, you just tossed your mask. You didn't put it in a garbage can that was right there, you tossed it. Right? So you see it everywhere. But you never saw like the masks in gutters or on the sidewalk or anything. And you saw, there was also another feature of the COVID era, you might remember the painted pebbles with, there's like little rocks that were painted, and the slogans that, Dr. Bonnie Henry was, be calm, be nice, or whatever it was, all those things. So you'd see those little accumulations of painted pebbles everywhere, but not the downtown east side, zero in the downtown east side. West Vancouver, everywhere, and they were really nice. It was like obviously the mom was doing them, right? They were supposed to like children's art, but but the mom was doing them. In North Vancouver, there were fewer, and in the Fraser Valley, they were about the same as North Vancouver. The masks, you could see the masks in West Vancouver were nicer than the masks in North Vancouver. So at that time, remember you could buy, remember in the beginning you could get the custom mask made out of material. Eventually they wanted you to go to the medical ones, but you'd see the more expensive ones that people actually paid money for, the higher end ones in West Vancouver. So it was really, we found quite a few interesting things. And one of the reasons I wanted to do this project, besides I was missing doing research at all, and I was missing working with really good research assistants, and I got tired of listening every day to all the people on the TV, because every day they would have the politicians, that would tell you, okay, that's important. Then they would have the doctors, okay, the doctors, that's important. Then occasionally they'd have economists who tell you what this is doing to the economy, but nothing ever else. But I'm saying, well, there's got to be a lot of other people who have opinions about what's going on and have some insight in what's going on. But I never saw it on the media. So that's one of the reasons why I, went into this. Like, I'm tired of listening to what the economists, the politicians, and doctors said. So I just decided to do like this socioeconomic thing. And it's always been my plan to go back 5 years later, which is right now, actually. I'm a little bit late, but maybe I'll make it 6 years later, to see what the difference would be between 5 years ago and now. Because I was doing this in January 2021, right? So it's 5 years later, and just to see. I mean, I'm certainly not going to see the same, but I still see masks discarded. I still see evidence of some of those big signs, which are now becoming part of the archaeological record, right? So it's kind of an interesting thing. And that's my story, and that's the end. Thank you.